Between 1941 and 1945, over 5.5 million Soviet soldiers fell into German captivity. By the war's end, fewer than 2 million would ever see their homeland again. This isn't just a statistic, it's one of the largest systematic destructions of human life in recorded history. Yet it remains largely unknown to the general public. What happened to these millions of men? Why did the German military, bound by international conventions, allow such unprecedented death rates among prisoners of war? And how did a nation that claimed to fight with honor orchestrate what would become one of the most devastating chapters of the Second World War? The answers lie buried in classified documents, forgotten testimonies, and mass graves scattered across Eastern Europe. Today, we uncover the deliberate machinery of death that consumed an entire generation of Soviet soldiers. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht captured Soviet soldiers at an unprecedented rate. In the first weeks alone, entire Soviet armies found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply lines, and forced to surrender. The numbers were staggering. By October 1941, German forces had captured over 2 million Red Army soldiers. But these weren't ordinary prisoners of war. From the moment of capture, Soviet soldiers faced a fate fundamentally different from their Western Allied counterparts. While British or American POWs could expect basic medical care, adequate food rations, and correspondence with home, Soviet prisoners encountered something entirely different. The mortality began immediately. During the initial marches from capture points to prison camps, thousands collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, and untreated wounds. German guards showed little interest in maintaining the health of their captives. Unlike the careful documentation maintained for Western prisoners, Soviet POWs were often treated as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving protection under international law. Camp Stalag 306 in Borisov provides a stark example of what awaited these men. Designed to hold 15,000 prisoners, it swelled to accommodate over 60,000 Soviet soldiers by late 1941. There were no proper barracks, no medical facilities, and no organized food distribution. Prisoners slept in the open, even as winter temperatures plummeted below freezing. The death toll at Borisov reached catastrophic levels within weeks. Bodies were removed daily by the hundreds, yet the dying continued at such a pace that mass graves couldn't be dug fast enough. Survivors later recalled how the ground became soft underfoot, not from rain, but from the decomposition occurring just beneath the surface. Dr. Hermann Keller, a German military physician who visited several prisoner camps in 1941, documented conditions that shocked even hardened military personnel. His reports described skeletal figures wandering aimless makeshift shelters constructed from corpses, and a complete breakdown of sanitary conditions that bred disease at alarming rates. But the horror at Borisov was not an aberration. It was the norm. Across dozens of camps from Belarus to Ukraine, the same patterns emerged. Massive overcrowding, deliberate starvation, and complete medical neglect created death factories operating under the guise of prisoner-of-war facilities. What made these conditions even more devastating was their systematic nature. This wasn't neglect born of wartime chaos or resource shortages. These were deliberate policies, carefully planned and methodically implemented. The question becomes, why did the German military, traditionally bound by codes of military honor, participate in such systematic destruction? The answer lies in the ideological framework that had been developing for months before the first shot was fired. 3 weeks before Operation Barbarossa began, Adolf Hitler issued a directive that would seal the fate of millions. The Commissar Order, officially known as the Guidelines for the Treatment of Political Commissars, declared that the upcoming conflict with the Soviet Union would be a war of annihilation, not merely territorial conquest. This order fundamentally altered how German forces would conduct themselves. Political commissars captured with Red Army units were to be eliminated immediately, without trial or documentation. But the implications extended far beyond commissars themselves. The order established a precedent that Soviet prisoners existed outside the protection of international law. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, recorded in his diary the briefing where Hitler explained his vision for the Eastern Front. The Führer declared that the war against the Soviet Union would be unlike previous campaigns. It would be, in his words, a clash between two incompatible worldviews where traditional military courtesy had no place. The Wehrmacht, despite its professional military traditions, largely embraced this ideological framework. Many officers had already been influenced by years of anti-Soviet propaganda that portrayed Bolsheviks as subhuman threats to European civilization. When combined with existing anti-Semitic attitudes and beliefs about Slavic racial inferiority, this created a perfect storm of dehumanization. The practical implementation of these policies became evident within days of the invasion. Soviet officers were separated from enlisted men and subjected to immediate interrogation. Those identified as political commissars faced execution, often in front of other prisoners as a psychological weapon. Even regular officers found themselves targets of systematic mistreatment that violated every principle of the Geneva Conventions. Colonel Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, issued supplementary instructions that expanded the scope of these policies. Any Soviet prisoner suspected of resistance activities, Communist Party membership, or even basic literacy could be singled out for special treatment. This effectively meant that any prisoner who demonstrated leadership qualities or education faced heightened risk. The ideological component also included explicit instructions about food distribution. German quartermasters received orders stating that Soviet prisoners should receive minimal rations, barely enough to sustain life for limited periods. The rationale was that these resources should be preserved for German forces, and that Soviet prisoners represented both military and ideological threats requiring permanent elimination. But perhaps most chilling was how these policies filtered down to individual soldiers and guards. Training materials distributed to German personnel emphasized that compassion toward Soviet prisoners constituted a betrayal of German racial destiny. Medical personnel received instructions that treating Soviet prisoners with the same care given to German wounded was inappropriate and potentially treasonous. The results were predictable and devastating. Within months of the invasion, reports began reaching Berlin about mortality rates in prisoner camps that exceeded anything seen in previous conflicts. Rather than prompting policy changes, these reports were often buried or ignored entirely. At Camp Stalag 307 near Deblin, German camp commander Major Rudolf Langenhoven implemented a system of deliberate psychological torture alongside physical deprivation. Prisoners were forced to watch executions of fellow captives, made to dispose of bodies without proper tools, and subjected to random violence designed to break their will to survive. These policies created a cascading effect of horror that would define the Soviet prisoner experience for the entire war. But the ideological framework was only the beginning. The practical implementation of these policies would prove even more devastating. The decision to starve Soviet prisoners was not born of wartime scarcity. It was a calculated weapon of war. German food distribution policies for prisoner camps reveal a systematic approach to using hunger as an instrument of death. In October 1941, German Army Quartermaster General Edward Wagner issued specific caloric guidelines for Soviet prisoners. While German soldiers received approximately 3,000 calories per day, Soviet prisoners were allocated just 700 calories, a starvation diet that medical experts knew would lead to death within months. The contrast becomes even starker when compared to treatment of Western Allied prisoners. British and American POWs received nearly 2,000 calories daily, supplemented by Red Cross packages and care packages from home. Soviet prisoners received no international aid, no family packages, and were explicitly denied access to relief organizations. Dr. Ferdinand Sauerbruch, one of Germany's leading physicians, conducted studies on starvation's effects during this period. His research, though conducted for different purposes, provided a medical roadmap for what was happening in the camps. The human body, he documented, begins consuming its own muscle mass after approximately 3 weeks of severe caloric restriction. After 6 weeks, vital organ function begins deteriorating rapidly. This medical knowledge was available to German camp administrators, yet policies remained unchanged. At Stalag 318 near Lambsdorff, camp records show that food allocations were actually reduced further during winter months. The rationale was that prisoners would be less active in cold weather and therefore require fewer calories. The psychological impact of starvation proved as devastating as the physical effects. Sergeant Ivan Kovalov, who survived captivity at 3 different camps, later described how constant hunger became the singular focus of prisoners' existence. Men would fight over breadcrumbs, attempt to eat grass and bark, and gradually lose all social bonds as survival instincts overwhelmed human compassion. German guards observed and documented these behavioral changes with clinical detachment. Camp reports describe prisoners becoming increasingly docile as starvation progressed, making them easier to manage with minimal guard staff. This was not an unintended consequence, but a desired outcome that aligned with broader policies of control through deprivation. The starvation was made more effective through psychological manipulation. Food was often delivered inconsistently. Prisoners might receive nothing for days, then be given slightly larger portions that were subsequently reduced again. This pattern prevented adaptation and maintained constant hope that was repeatedly crushed. At some camps, guards implemented forced labor requirements, even as prisoners received starvation rations. Men weakened by months of malnutrition were required to perform construction work, dig trenches, or clear forests. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were often left where they fell, creating additional psychological pressure on surviving prisoners. The German military justified these policies through racial ideology, but internal documents reveal more pragmatic considerations. Quartermaster reports noted that maintaining Soviet prisoners at minimal survival levels freed up resources for German forces while still extracting labor value from the captives. Major Hans Korner, quartermaster at Stalag 350, wrote detailed reports about the efficiency of this system. He calculated that a Soviet prisoner could provide approximately 4 to 6 months of useful labor before malnutrition rendered them unable to work. After this point, he recommended they should be relocated to what he termed final processing facilities. The systematic nature of starvation policies becomes clear when examining camp mortality statistics. Death rates remained remarkably consistent across different locations, different seasons, and different prisoner populations. This consistency could only result from centralized planning and implementation. By winter 1941, German medical personnel were reporting that Soviet prisoners were dying at rates that exceeded the camp administration's ability to dispose of bodies properly. Rather than increasing food allocations, authorities focused on more efficient methods of body disposal. The starvation weapon proved devastatingly effective, but it was complemented by other systematic policies designed to accelerate prisoner mortality. German medical policies toward Soviet prisoners created what can only be described as perfect conditions for epidemic diseases. Unlike accidental disease outbreaks, these were predictable and preventable medical catastrophes that authorities allowed to proceed unchecked. The overcrowding in prisoner camps created ideal conditions for communicable diseases to spread rapidly. At Stalag 307, over 45,000 prisoners were confined in a space designed for 8,000. Without proper sanitation facilities, disease transmission became inevitable. Yet German authorities refused to implement even basic public health measures that might have contained outbreaks. Typhus emerged as the primary killer in many camps during late 1941. This louse-borne disease thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions where prisoners had no access to soap, clean clothing, or washing facilities. German medical personnel understood how to prevent and treat typhus. They had successfully controlled outbreaks among their own forces throughout the war. Dr. Heinrich Rose, a German army physician assigned to prisoner camp inspections, filed reports documenting typhus outbreaks that he described as entirely preventable. His recommendations for basic sanitation improvements, delousing procedures, and quarantine protocols were repeatedly ignored by camp administrators. The contrast with German medical care was stark. German soldiers received regular delousing, access to medical personnel, and immediate treatment for typhus symptoms. Soviet prisoners were left in conditions that virtually guaranteed disease transmission, then denied medical intervention when they became ill. At many camps, sick prisoners were simply segregated into separate areas without medical care. These became known as dying barracks, where men were essentially left to expire. Guards would check these areas daily, removing bodies but providing no treatment for those still clinging to life. Dysentery represented another systematic medical catastrophe. This intestinal disease, spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation, could be easily prevented through basic hygiene measures. German forces maintained strict sanitation protocols for their own water supplies, while allowing Soviet prisoners to drink from contaminated sources. The medical neglect extended to basic wound care. Many Soviet prisoners had been wounded during capture but received no medical treatment. Infections that could have been easily treated with basic antiseptics were allowed to develop into life-threatening conditions. Amputations that could have prevented death from gangrene were not performed. German medical personnel assigned to prisoner camps faced explicit instructions about treatment limitations. Dr. Friedrich Wagner, serving at Stalag 306, later testified that he was instructed not to waste medical supplies on Soviet prisoners unless they were specifically needed for labor purposes. The psychological impact of watching fellow prisoners die from preventable diseases added another layer of torment. Survivors described the horror of seeing previously healthy men waste away from diseases that were readily treatable in civilian hospitals just kilometers away. Some German medical personnel documented their objections to these policies. Dr. Albert Hirschfeld wrote detailed reports about medical conditions in prisoner camps, recommending immediate interventions that could save thousands of lives. His superiors filed these reports without action and eventually transferred him away from prisoner facilities. The tuberculosis epidemic that swept through many camps during 1942 provides another example of deliberate medical neglect. This respiratory disease, highly contagious in overcrowded conditions, could have been contained through basic isolation and treatment protocols. Instead, tubercular prisoners were left in general population areas where they infected others. At Stalag 333, German records show that over 400 prisoners died from tuberculosis in a single month during winter 1942. The camp had medical facilities capable of treating the disease and German medical personnel familiar with appropriate protocols. None of these resources were deployed for Soviet prisoners. The disease outbreaks were so severe that they eventually threatened German personnel working at the camps. Only then did authorities implement limited protective measures, but exclusively for German staff. Soviet prisoners continued to face the full impact of epidemics that authorities now recognized as preventable and treatable. These medical policies represented one of the most systematic forms of destruction employed against Soviet prisoners. But even more direct forms of violence were simultaneously being implemented. By 1942, as Germany faced increasing labor shortages, a cynical calculation emerged regarding Soviet prisoners. Rather than simply allowing them to die in camps, authorities decided to extract maximum economic value before their inevitable deaths through exhaustive forced labor programs. The infamous destruction through work concept was formally applied to Soviet prisoners through a series of directives that treated human beings as consumable industrial resources. German economic planners calculated that a severely weakened prisoner could still provide 3 to 4 months of useful labor before becoming economically unproductive. Construction of the Atlantic Wall, Germany's massive coastal fortification system, relied heavily on Soviet prisoner labor. These men, already weakened by months of starvation and disease, were forced to perform backbreaking construction work under impossible conditions. The mortality rate among prisoners assigned to Atlantic Wall construction exceeded 80% within 6 months. At the Dora underground rocket facility, where V-2 missiles were manufactured, Soviet prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in poorly ventilated tunnels while receiving minimal food rations. German production records show that prisoner productivity declined steadily as malnutrition took its toll, yet no adjustments were made to working conditions or food allocations. The SS-owned enterprises presented some of the most horrific examples of exploitative labor. At the Desti quarries, Soviet prisoners were forced to extract stone under conditions that even German overseers described as murderous. Men weakened by starvation were required to move massive stone blocks using only primitive tools and human muscle power. German industrial planners developed detailed calculations about the economic value of Soviet prisoner labor. Internal documents reveal cost-benefit analyses that weighed the expense of feeding prisoners against their productive output. These calculations treated human lives as mathematical variables in economic equations. The construction of military airfields across occupied Europe consumed thousands of Soviet prisoners. At the Prenzlau airfield project, German engineers noted that prisoner mortality rates reached 60% during the construction phase. Rather than addressing working conditions, they simply requested more prisoners to maintain construction schedules. Railroad construction presented another deadly assignment for Soviet prisoners. The expansion of railway lines to support military logistics required massive labor inputs. Prisoners assigned to railroad work faced particularly harsh conditions, working in all weather while living in temporary camps that provided minimal shelter. German corporate records reveal the extent of civilian industry participation in this system. Major corporations, including IG Farben, Krupp, and Volkswagen, employed Soviet prisoners under conditions that company executives knew would lead to high mortality rates. Internal correspondence shows that these companies calculated prisoner replacement rates into their production planning. The agricultural sector also exploited Soviet prisoner labor extensively. Farms across Germany employed prisoners during harvest seasons, but at caloric intake levels that made sustained agricultural work impossible. Prisoners assigned to farm labor often ate raw vegetables and grain in desperate attempts to supplement their inadequate rations. Mining operations proved particularly lethal for Soviet prisoners. The coal mines of the Ruhr Valley employed thousands of prisoners in dangerous underground conditions. Mine safety protocols applied to German workers were systematically ignored for Soviet prisoners, resulting in accident rates that exceeded normal mining dangers by extraordinary margins. At some industrial sites, German managers implemented productivity-based food rationing systems. Prisoners who met production quotas received slightly larger food portions, while those who failed to meet targets had their already inadequate rations reduced further. This created internal competition that accelerated physical deterioration. The transportation of prisoners between work sites often proved as deadly as the work itself. Packed into unheated railroad cars without adequate food or water, many prisoners died during transit between facilities. German logistics personnel calculated these transportation losses as acceptable shrinkage in their labor supply chain. German technical personnel documented the declining productivity of prisoner labor over time. Engineering reports noted that prisoner work output decreased steadily as physical condition deteriorated. Rather than addressing the underlying causes, German planners simply increased the number of prisoners assigned to projects to maintain production levels. The systematic exploitation of prisoner labor represented one of the largest forced labor programs in human history. But this economic exploitation operated alongside even more direct forms of systematic killing. German authorities developed sophisticated systems for categorizing Soviet prisoners, determining who might temporarily survive and who would face immediate death. These selection processes, carried out with bureaucratic precision, decided the fate of millions based on racial ideology and perceived economic utility. Upon arrival at prisoner camps, Soviet soldiers faced immediate screening procedures that would determine their chances of survival. German personnel used elaborate classification systems that divided prisoners into categories based on ethnicity, education level, military rank, and perceived political reliability. Prisoners identified as Jewish faced immediate execution under existing anti-Semitic policies. But the selection process extended far beyond religious identification. Ethnic minorities from Soviet Central Asia, prisoners with visible education, and anyone suspected of Communist Party membership were marked for elimination. The infamous intelligence tests administered to some prisoners served not to identify intellectual capability, but to target educated individuals for execution. German authorities feared that educated prisoners might organize resistance activities or maintain morale among fellow captives. At Stalag 333, Camp Commandant Colonel Heinrich Müller implemented a selection system that divided incoming prisoners into three categories: those suitable for labor, those requiring immediate medical attention, and those deemed unproductive. The third category faced transportation to what were euphemistically called special facilities. German medical personnel participated directly in selection processes, using their professional authority to provide pseudo-scientific justification for murder. Doctors would examine prisoners and declare some medically unsuitable for camp conditions, knowing this designation meant death. The selections often targeted prisoners who displayed leadership qualities or attempted to maintain military discipline among their fellow captives. German authorities understood that eliminating natural leaders would accelerate the demoralization process among remaining prisoners. Religious selection created another category for immediate elimination: Orthodox priests, Muslim clerics, and anyone identified as providing spiritual leadership to other prisoners faced systematic targeting. German authorities recognized that religious faith provided psychological resistance to their dehumanization programs. The selection process included psychological evaluation, designed to identify prisoners with strong willpower or resistance potential. German personnel looked for individuals who maintained military bearing, attempted to organize fellow prisoners, or showed signs of continued hope for liberation. At some camps, selections were conducted through deliberate psychological torture. Prisoners would be forced to choose between fellow captives for various assignments, knowing that some selections would result in death. This process was designed to break down social bonds and create guilt among survivors. The efficiency of selection processes improved throughout the war, as German authorities gained experience in mass categorization of human beings. What began as crude sorting procedures evolved into sophisticated systems that could process thousands of prisoners daily. German administrative records reveal the bureaucratic precision applied to these life-and-death decisions. Detailed forms documented each prisoner's classification, with specific codes indicating their assigned fate. This paperwork created an official record that disguised mass murder as administrative procedure. The selections often separated family members and friends who had been captured together. German authorities understood that maintaining social connections provided emotional support that enhanced survival chances. Breaking these bonds served the broader goal of accelerating prisoner mortality. Some German personnel documented their discomfort with selection procedures, but few refused to participate. Military discipline and ideological indoctrination proved sufficient to ensure compliance with policies that many individuals privately questioned. The selection process represented the systematic application of racial ideology to determine human worth. But these categorizations were merely the prelude to systematic execution programs that would claim millions of lives. As the war progressed, German authorities moved beyond neglect and exploitation towards systematic execution of Soviet prisoners. What emerged was a coordinated program designed to eliminate specific categories of captives through direct violence. The Einsatzgruppen, SS killing units operating behind German lines, received explicit instructions to identify and execute Soviet prisoners who fit particular criteria. These mobile killing units would visit prisoner camps to conduct selections and carry out mass executions of targeted individuals. At Stalag 308 near Neuhammer, SS personnel conducted regular visits to select prisoners for what they termed special treatment. Camp records show that over 3,000 prisoners were removed from the camp during these visits and never returned. German authorities provided no documentation about their ultimate fate. The execution sites were often located near prisoner camps, but operated with complete secrecy. Prisoners selected for execution would be transported short distances to predetermined killing grounds, where they would be eliminated and buried in mass graves. German authorities developed standard procedures for these executions that prioritized efficiency while minimizing psychological impact on German personnel. The killing process was systematized to reduce individual responsibility and maintain operational security. The scale of these execution programs becomes clear through German administrative records that have survived. Transportation logs show regular movement of prisoners from camps to undisclosed locations. Return transportation was never arranged, indicating the ultimate purpose of these transfers. Local German populations were often aware of execution activities, but rarely intervened or reported what they witnessed. The systematic nature of these programs required coordination between military personnel, SS units, and civilian authorities who collectively enabled mass murder. Soviet prisoners designated as politically dangerous faced particular targeting for execution. This category included former Communist Party members, government officials, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of potential resistance leadership. The execution programs expanded to include prisoners who were simply consuming resources without providing adequate labor productivity. German economic calculations determined that eliminating unproductive prisoners would improve the overall efficiency of forced labor programs. At some locations, German authorities implemented experimental killing methods designed to increase efficiency while reducing resource expenditure. These experiments in mass murder would later inform the development of systematic killing programs in concentration camps. The documentation of execution programs was deliberately minimal to maintain operational security. German authorities understood that detailed records of mass murder could create legal liability if discovered by enemy forces. Some German military personnel objected to participation in systematic prisoner executions. However, refusal to participate typically resulted in transfer to combat units rather than serious disciplinary action, indicating that alternatives existed for those who chose to seek them. The execution programs represented the logical conclusion of policies that had dehumanized Soviet prisoners from the moment of capture. These systematic killing operations eliminated hundreds of thousands of prisoners who might otherwise have survived the war. The coordination required for these execution programs reveals the extent of institutional participation in prisoner destruction. This was not the work of isolated individuals, but of systematic governmental policies implemented through official channels. But even as systematic execution programs eliminated hundreds of thousands, the broader machinery of death through neglect, starvation, and disease continued operating at full capacity. Those Soviet prisoners who managed to survive German captivity faced an ordeal that extended far beyond their liberation. Liberation brought no relief, only new forms of persecution that would define their remaining years. Surviving prisoners shocked even hardened Allied medical personnel. These skeletal figures, weighing 30 to 50% less than normal, suffered from multiple diseases and severe psychological trauma that exceeded anything witnessed in other theaters of war. But repatriation proved almost as traumatic as captivity itself. Soviet authorities regarded returned prisoners with deep suspicion, believing survival indicated collaboration with German forces. Stalin's government established special filtration camps where returning prisoners underwent months of investigation, treated as potential traitors rather than victims. Many survivors faced immediate imprisonment in Soviet labor camps upon their return. Their exposure to Western ideas and survival of German captivity was considered evidence of political unreliability. The NKVD processed returning prisoners through systems designed to identify collaborators and eliminate security threats. Employment discrimination became widespread in post-war Soviet society. Former prisoners found themselves marked as security risks, excluded from jobs, universities, and social opportunities. Their children faced similar discrimination, limiting social mobility for entire families across generations. The social stigma attached to surrender created profound isolation. Soviet wartime propaganda had emphasized that honorable soldiers should die rather than surrender, leaving survivors to bear guilt and shame for their continued existence within their own communities. Medical complications from captivity persisted throughout survivors' lives. Malnutrition had caused permanent damage to organs, bones, and nervous systems. Psychological trauma manifested in nightmares, depression, and anxiety disorders that received little recognition or treatment in Soviet society. Soviet authorities actively suppressed documentation of survivor experiences, preferring to maintain silence about prisoner losses. Personal testimonies were discouraged, and official historical accounts minimized both the number of prisoners taken and the extent of their suffering. The international community largely ignored Soviet prisoner survivors. Unlike Western Allied prisoners who received extensive support and recognition, these men rebuilt their lives through extraordinary personal resilience rather than institutional support, representing a testament to human endurance under the most extreme conditions. Their survival came at a price that extended decades beyond their liberation, creating wounds that never fully healed. The systematic destruction of Soviet prisoners required extensive institutional coordination across multiple levels of German government, military, and civilian organizations. Understanding this machinery reveals how modern bureaucratic systems can be adapted for systematic murder. The German Army High Command issued fundamental policy directives establishing different treatment standards for Soviet prisoners compared to Western Allied captives. Wehrmacht quartermaster units developed logistical systems ensuring Soviet prisoners received starvation-level rations while maintaining adequate supplies for German forces. German medical personnel participated through official policies denying health care to Soviet prisoners while maintaining full medical support for German forces. Civilian administrative agencies coordinated prisoner labor assignments with industrial concerns, creating mechanisms that channeled prisoners toward deadly work assignments. Industrial corporations integrated Soviet prisoner labor into production planning, through contracts specifying acceptable mortality rates as part of labor supply calculations. Major companies including IG Farben, Krupp, and Volkswagen employed prisoners under conditions executives knew would lead to high death rates. German Railway Administration facilitated prisoner transportation through scheduling systems, accommodating high mortality during transit. Local civilian authorities provided administrative support through building permits, utility connections, and waste disposal services enabling camp operations. The SS developed specialized procedures for identifying and eliminating specific prisoner categories, operating through official protocols that disguised systematic murder as administrative processing. Legal professionals crafted regulatory frameworks placing Soviet prisoners outside international law while maintaining appearance of compliance. The coordination demonstrates how ordinary institutional processes can be adapted for extraordinary criminal purposes. Each organization maintained normal administrative procedures while collectively enabling mass murder. The efficiency exceeded improvised killing programs by providing sustainable systems capable of processing millions of victims. Documentation was deliberately minimized to reduce legal liability while maintaining operational effectiveness. The participation of civilian institutions reveals how prisoner destruction required broad societal collaboration rather than isolated military action. This institutional machinery provided a model later applied to other systematic killing programs, with administrative expertise developed through prisoner policies contributing to subsequent genocidal activities. The fate of Soviet prisoners represents one of history's largest systematic killings, yet remains largely absent from public consciousness. Understanding why this tragedy has been overlooked reveals important patterns about historical memory and political considerations. Soviet authorities actively suppressed information about prisoner losses for decades after the war. Official accounts minimized both the number captured and extent of suffering, preferring to emphasize heroic resistance rather than victimization. Western scholarship initially focused primarily on Nazi persecution of Jewish populations and civilian victims, giving less attention to systematic destruction of Soviet military personnel. German military personnel responsible for prisoner policies largely escaped post-war prosecution, unlike SS personnel involved in concentration camp operations. The Cold War climate created additional barriers to investigating Soviet prisoner experiences. Western governments showed little interest in highlighting Soviet victimization while confronting Soviet expansion in Europe. At Nuremberg, prisoner treatment issues focused primarily on Western Allied prisoners rather than Soviet victims. Historical research began expanding during the 1990s as classified archives became accessible. Contemporary scholarship has established that mortality rates among Soviet prisoners exceeded 90% in many locations, representing losses that surpassed those of any other military group. The scale of prisoner deaths exceeded the population of many European nations, yet receives far less public attention than other wartime atrocities with smaller victim counts. Educational curricula provide minimal coverage, contributing to continued ignorance about one of the war's major atrocities. Memorial activities remain limited compared to commemoration of other wartime losses. The absence of prominent survivor advocacy groups has restricted efforts to maintain public awareness. Unlike other victim populations who organized effective campaigns, the historical record now clearly establishes that prisoner destruction resulted not from wartime chaos, but from deliberate policies implemented through systematic institutional coordination. The millions who perished deserve recognition as casualties of systematic policies ranking among history's greatest crimes against humanity. The systematic destruction of Soviet prisoners of war stands as one of history's most devastating yet overlooked tragedies. 5.5 million men entered German captivity, and fewer than 2 million ever returned home. This wasn't wartime chaos or resource shortages. It was deliberate policy implemented through sophisticated institutional coordination. From the Commissar order that placed Soviet prisoners outside international law to systematic starvation, disease, forced labor, and execution, German authorities created machinery of destruction that operated with bureaucratic efficiency. The survivors faced additional persecution upon returning to the Soviet Union, where their survival was viewed with suspicion rather than celebrated. Understanding the fate of Soviet prisoners reveals how ordinary institutions can be adapted for extraordinary criminal purposes, and how historical memory can be shaped by political considerations. Their story serves as a crucial reminder that protecting prisoners of war represents one of civilization's most fundamental humanitarian principles, and that abandoning these protections opens the door to systematic atrocities that can consume millions of lives. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.